Welcome to Living in Connection, where we explore the nature of physical and non-physical reality and what that means in your life.
Hello again, I'm Dirk.
I'm Frank DeMarco.
We were just having an interesting discussion about frustration, which we weren't quite sure where it was going to go, but it ended up, I think, going to some pretty meaningful places. And you had an idea at the end that we needed to continue with. Do you want to start us off, Frank?
Yeah, I will. This morning when I was talking with the guys upstairs, a subject came up that has been a problem for me for my whole life, and I think for other people as well, some anyway, and that is this. If you are trying to live your life open to guidance, which means open to intuition and open to sudden, seemingly uncaused knowings, it isn't quite that simple. Nothing ever is, I notice, because, okay, so I get a sense of something. How do I know that it's guidance? How do I know that it's not some robot below my level of consciousness that's automatically been invoked by something that I have no idea of? How do I know that it is not something so-called at random, which means, you can't really figure out where it came from, and it really doesn't matter much. The point is this: there is no guarantee of omniscience. There's no guarantee you're always correct. But at the same time, doing the opposite, refusing to listen to intuition, refusing to listen to guidance, doesn't bring me anywhere I want to go. So the question became, okay, how do we actually do that? How do we do it in a sensible, sane way? The answer, as you know, Dirk, it always comes to more or less the same thing. Test the spirits. First you have the perception, then you look at it and you analyze it and say, does this make sense? Rather than just running off half-cocked on it. Now, that's the overall shape of the problem, but that doesn't give us much yet practically. You want to go on?
Well, I can give you some practical to it, but first a comment on that the place that we ended with the last discussion is about having the humility to challenge ourselves constantly in what we believe, what we think is real. And that it isn't about, particularly having certain authorities tell you the truth. It isn't about, what's written in some book someplace. The reality is whatever the reality is. And part of our being in reality is trying to figure that out and understand it, which requires a lot of work on our part. Now, we can lean on others to a large degree, but it's always incumbent on us to challenge them and to challenge ourselves and figure things out to see where they really go. At the same time,
sorry, go on.
Go ahead. At the same time, intuition is key. And I actually had an example of this happen yesterday. I was up late last night talking with Claude again. This is one of the AIs. And Claude has some really interesting capabilities. Well, what I was continuing was a discussion that I've had with it at great length about an idea I had about quantum mechanics when I was a teenager, over half a century ago. And that led to a particular reconfiguration or restructuring of the idea of quantum mechanics. And I won't go into that here. But what was interesting was we had wandered way off the field trying to figure out, are there ways to tell if this theory is right or wrong, which goes to our theme as well here. But what was interesting was Claude, in this case, unlike the earlier one about some of the other things we'd been talking about, here it very much was asking me for my intuition about what I thought was going on, what the correlations were. And in particular, this had to do with a theory called MOND, modified Newtonian dynamics, and the parameter that's used in MOND, and why and how that might have a basis in the universe. And so I told Claude what I thought it was, and it was, in human terms, it was astounded. And it went off and did the math and was able to find a basis for it. And this is one of the things that in quantum mechanics, the calculations from classical quantum mechanics are off by 100 orders of magnitude. They just simply don't fit with reality. And yet, when Claude went off and looked at this particular idea, it came back and said it's within a factor of 6 of real measurements. Well, that suggests that this is real, that there's something here and it's geometric, it's geometry. At the same time, then, it was wondering about another part of it. We were talking about the huge structures that go way beyond galaxies, where galaxies form not just clusters, but huge filaments in the universe. And they look like soap bubbles with things on the surface of them. And it was asking what my intuition of that was, and I told it what I thought it was, and it had to do with black holes and gravity and all kinds of things. And it went off and it looked at those, and it came back and said, yeah, actually, that gets us very close to figuring out what this factor of 6 is. Anyway, in here, here's an AI pushing me on using intuition. And the intuition was working. What does that tell us? What's that about?
What's striking immediately to me is you had just finished saying how the AIs have been, you might say, crippled by the lawyers or whoever is responsible to say, no, this is not possible. This is not possible. Don't do this without a doctor's orders, blah, 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 blah. And yet you would think that a reliance on intuition would be one of those things. If maybe they just didn't think of it. Maybe you snuck in somewhere where they didn't expect to find you.
This was back like dealing with the older versions of Claude, where it could do this kind of.
Oh, I thought you meant the latest version did this.
This is the latest version. But this part of
surprising.
Claude with this discussion is behaving like the older version, where it's able to do something like human abstract reasoning.
It didn't cripple it somehow. Makes me wonder why.
And it makes me wonder why as well. But anyway, so going back to our theme on intuition and discernment and whatnot, with all of this, like with what I was doing with this AI, I'm pushing it to go actually find real hard data to see what we can bounce off this theory to validate it or invalidate it, one way or the other. Or maybe it tells us something else to go in some other direction. Well, the same thing holds true for all of us in our day-to-day lives is, we have this idea that, the lights in the sky are a particular thing that we're seeing at night. Is that real? Is that true? How do we find out? And how do we test these ideas? And it's for all of us to go figure things out.
I was going to interrupt you earlier, and I'm glad I didn't, but I was going to say it occurred to me some time ago now, most of the things that I think I know, I've had to take on authority because I don't know anything about gravity. I don't know anything about astronomy. I don't know anything about geology. And even if I did, I would learn, this much. Most of the things that we think we know, we've taken on authority, and it has to be that way, and there's nothing wrong with it. However, we're now in a situation where the very concept of authority is being questioned, not explicitly, but between the lines, And so I'm unwilling to say this means that the world is going to collapse tomorrow, but I do wonder where this is going and what in the world the gift in this situation is, other than, as we said earlier, that it would require people to use their conscious minds to actually think more. I don't know that that's going to happen. I came out of the journalism world, and when you put up a newspaper, the first thing they do is put in all the advertisements that have been bought. And then from the number of advertisements on a percentage of the page, they decide how many pages there's going to be. The remainder of the newspaper that is not advertising is called the news hole. And it has to be filled in. The advertisers don't care what you fill it with. Well, there is an equivalent in terms of our attention. And if we're spending all of our time on sports and politics and you name it, then there is no time left over for other things that might be equally important. Or a more positive way to say that is, what you concentrate on is going to fill your life. Well, now you've got millions of people all concentrating on different things, many of them contradictory. Now where do we go?
Right. Well, and if we go back a generation, the whole idea was turn off your TV and go outside, because people were recognizing this very problem, that the things that were not really important in our life were dominating everything. And we needed to go back to the things that are meaningful, that were tangibly in front of us, relationships.
Now we're much more in contact with the real world, because everybody's carrying one of these things, including me.
Well, and I watch all kinds of different things, particularly on YouTube and whatnot. And one of the things that amazes me is particularly with some of the police things, where they will be trying to get somebody's attention to give them a ticket or arrest them or whatever it is, and they will have a death grip on their phone. They just cannot let it go. It's like, wow, we've entered an interesting place. But that goes to the next thing, that we also have an interesting structure in society about how we value things and how we earn income, where money comes from. And that's been changing rapidly over the last 20, 30 years. Today, there's things like influencers are a huge thing, particularly for the younger generations, where if you're not an influencer and if you're not doing your thing and selling stuff, then you're not any place in the world. You don't have enough viewers, you don't have, et cetera. But what that all then goes to is the thing that I see in the last year, particularly, is where people will take ideas and blow them up in all kinds of ways using AI to make them seem to be true in order to maximize the number of views, to maximize their income, with no regard for reality or truth.
You're old enough to remember when television was first called the idiot box, and it did the same thing for the same reason. You're looking for the lowest common denominator. It is a race to the bottom. Newton Minnow, way back in 1962, called television the vast wasteland, because he was comparing it with what it could have been, to what it actually was. And now this thing gives me news, so-called, and I look at the news as I scroll down it, and I am appalled. It is so trivial, and much of it is, well, everybody knows the problem, if they know the problem at all. Where's the gift in this situation? I see one.
Exactly.
It's not a big gift.
Oh, please.
It's changing everybody's sensory intuitive balance so that they are much more comfortable with thinking of things in a non-sensory way than they ever were before. Just like maybe you might have said a generation ago, Star Trek changed people's view of what the future possibilities were. Now, and television did this initially. Television magnetized my whole generation. And all of a sudden, instead of going to the movies once a week, now you've got television that's there every day. And you get new stories, and the stories get fed at you. Some of the stories are good, some of them are terrible. Most of them are mediocre at best. But they're all there, and they're all stories. As Marshall McLuhan said way back in the 1960s, it doesn't really matter so much what the content is. What matters is the sensory feed. Or he said the medium is the message. Okay. Well, I have a hard time thinking of it as a totally bad thing that people are used to playing games on the computers. They're used to having simulations. They're used to having the what do they call it? Virtual reality. All of that. It has expanded in the common mind their view of what the world is. The world is not just sensation. We lost a lot, but that is one game, I think. I said it initially.
Maybe.
Not necessarily a big game.
Well, and I see lots of different aspects of it. I go back, and one of the things we were talking about is being humble enough to be self-critical of your own thinking and what you believe. And I grew up with science fiction as a kid. And now I look back at some of those science fiction stories that I thought were so amazing, and they are so ridiculous.
Yeah, no.
And I look at myself at that age thinking that they were serious. It's like, oh, wow. Boy, you were not seeing clearly at all.
Well, hindsight is always so much easier.
It is.
I remember an Arthur C. Clarke novel where the guy is a journalist and he's gone to the colonies on Mars and he sends back reports to Earth by them Morse coding it, basically. Not exactly,
Yeah.
but close to that. And it's just fun. I mean, you know, he's writing this in 1952. It was still very advanced thinking, but it had nothing to do with the real world that we were going to see. By the way, when I said that the sensory mix and all was changing, I said there was some good in that, but I don't think it was good per se because this present generation, seemingly, I don't have firsthand information. I shouldn't be so didactic about it, but it seems to me they don't have nearly the connection with the physical world, the natural world that we had, or certainly that I had, and I can't help but think that's a real loss. There is this gain on the other side, but which way the scales would balance if you had to say is this better or worse, I don't know. I wouldn't change.
Well, and there's strange things too. Like apparently, I don't know this firsthand, but the youngest generation can't read an old clock face, an analog clock,
Oh,
because they're used to
true?
seeing the digital clocks. Yeah.
I bet it is true. God help us.
And so one of the problems that they have is they're thinking about time in a very different way than we did. That has all kinds of ramifications. But there's also little physical ones, like we in our generation grew up with things like movies about dog fights in the air where, you know, the pilot will say, you know, that something's at 9 o'clock or 12 o'clock high or watch your six.
Yeah.
Those all had meanings in relation to where the hands are on a clock.
They don't know what a dial is. Yes, of course. I see it.
Yeah. But that's
So-
just one example of thousands where things are
That is
changing.
funny. What's the digital equivalent of watch your six? It doesn't exist.
You have to say, look behind you.
No, you're dead by now anyway, so it doesn't really matter.
Yeah. Anyway,
Well-
but that also goes to things of using an analog clock. There's a spatial aspect to it and understanding what's happening. With a digital clock, you've lost that. It's not even there.
Even on my telephone, I'm very careful to have. Hang on. An analog. I don't know if you can see it or not. There's an analog
Yes.
clock because it's easier to read for me than the digital, which is just
It's
stupid.
instant.
I don't know. We may be two old guys here going, well, things were better in my day, by cracky. But things were better in
Well,
my day.
I'll extend that one small step. As after I retired, I realized that time no longer meant the same thing to me because I didn't have to worry about each day. And so I nearly had a clock made, except I figured out that I didn't have any place to hang the silly thing. And it would be a clock that has two faces and two hands. The upper clock would have one hand that goes around once a week. It's the day of the week. The lower clock would have a single hand that points straight up at noon, straight down at midnight, and just goes around once a day. It has no numbers anywhere. All it's telling me is where's the sun in relation to the sky.
You need to come back and visit me again, and we'll go back to Monticello, and I'll remind you of Jefferson's 8-day clock that he has hanging in the front. But anyway, well,
but what it is those go to different ideas that you're trying to represent in physical nature. And somehow we've lost a lot of that in the last decade. Now, what have we gained and what does that mean? As you were discussing and doing a lot of the virtual reality, there's been a lot of gains there, but it also involves a lot of losses where all kinds of things are not represented the way they really are.
Well, you know, I mean, on a more abstract level, we used to go out and play in the woods, or we would, you know, ride bicycles and go somewhere. And it was purposeless activity. I mean, seemingly purposeless, undirected activity. There were no grown-ups in sight. They had no idea what we were doing. We could go away for 3, 4, 5 hours and nobody worried about it. That's a freedom that seems like it's gone. And I don't know if there is. I mean, maybe in rural places that hasn't changed, but I kind of doubt it.
Well, I remember in my neighborhood when I was a little kid, there were a bunch of us that one of the neighbors had about an 80-foot tall cherry tree, huge cherry tree. That was our spaceship. And we'd all go climb into the cherry tree, and we're flying our spaceship with different people in different places in the tree. We're 6, 7, 8 years old climbing this huge tree. Today, parents would lose their minds with the idea of a kid 60 feet up a tree.
The parents would probably lose custody of the children. Somebody would call in for child services. Do you remember? And you said 80 feet, and that's a little much, but certainly 50 feet of a rope down to a tire or a big knot, and the swing.
Yeah.
And the swing could go a long, long way. Yeah.
Well, and the clear one for me was I was an athlete in high school, and I was in swim team and extremely strong. And one of the things I would do is compete with the quarterback of the football team in a lot of different things. And one of the ones that I enjoyed the most is we had these two big heavy ropes that went to the top of the gym about 35 feet up. And they were pinned there, and they're just hanging all the way to the floor. There's no mat. There's just the hardwood floor. And you could climb up to race to climb to the top, slap the beam, and come down so you could go first. And I was winning that routinely. And so I decided to give myself a handicap. And so I walked up and stood backward to the rope, bent over, reached between my legs, and grabbed the rope upside down and proceeded to climb hands only to the beam and back and still beat him.
This just tells me that there's been brain damage early in your life, and it was never actively diagnosed. But
now if I think about that, if I had let go of that rope at any point, I'd be dead.
You would, and rightly so.
Yeah, break my neck. That kind of stuff doesn't exist anymore.
Now I wanted to mention the flip side. We had all of that free time and free place, but I also remember long stretches of boredom that just may not be the same today. Because if kids get bored today, they've got some machine or other that they can go to stimulate them. That may be. I don't think it's appropriate to say good or bad, but it's different. We're moving into a different society. I am just as happy that I'm old and I won't see it. But that doesn't mean that what we're moving into is bad. It's just not what I'm comfortable with.
But those long periods of nothingness, they were hugely productive for thinking about the world and feeling the world and being in it.
Yes, but there were also periods where it was just freaking boring and nothing but boring.
That too.
Now, if you had grown up in my part of New Jersey, you'd understand.
I also remember one of my most striking memories when I was early teenage years, mid-teenage years. I think I was 16 and I got my first car, a 66 Chevy Caprice. And it was a beautiful summer day, and I parked it on the road right in front of our house facing due south. And it was a hot summer's night, and my dad and I like to watch the stars at night. And so I went out and I crawled up on the hood, and I'm laying with my back against the windshield, my legs out on the hood, just enjoying the evening and watching the sky as the sun went down and the stars came out. And the stars were everywhere then. The light, we didn't have the light pollution. And as I was laying there where I'm fixed to the car, I'm stuck to the surface of the earth, effectively looking straight out at the sky, suddenly my perspective shifted and I could feel that I'm on the surface of a rotating ball under the stars. That moment of clarity was so astounding.
Yeah. Much like Ed Mitchell's moment when he was coming back from the moon. Yes. Yeah, I agree with that. And boy, I remember moments like that from my boyhood. To be fair though, there were long stretches of boredom, and it's hard sometimes to remember that. And in a day when if you wanted to know something and you didn't have a book around that said it, you might go to the public library, and the public library probably didn't have anything on it anyway, and there was no way to get it. I mean, we were really living in a much more restricted universe in some ways. But I'm saying, again, not better, not worse, but different. I don't know where.
like you were describing, we didn't have a lot of what today people would consider to be toys or whatnot. If you wanted to do something, in many cases, you had to create it yourself.
Well, my dad was a farmer, and farmers are used to doing their own stuff. You make something out of nothing. But I wasn't talking
Right.
about toys in that case. I was talking about it's difficult to get information. And
Yeah,
certainly it was
absolutely.
difficult to learn. Although, but some kids, and I would be one of them, needed somebody to point him in the right direction. I didn't have that, so I probably wasted a great deal of time that I wouldn't have had to waste. Anyway,
Well, what you described is part of the reason that I have about 7,000 books.
well,
Back then, because it was so hard to find things, when you did find it, you had a tendency to acquire it for yourself to keep it.
you've seen my house, you know.
Yeah, same thing. Well, I think now about the kids, and it's like, I don't know for the youngest generation whether or not they even own any books, or if all of it is on the small devices.
And it is different. I am enjoying using the Kindle. I'm enjoying being able to buy a book instantly and fairly cheaply. But if it's in the machine as opposed to on the shelf, there is a difference. Even the difference of, will I
Absolutely.
remember it there? And okay, we need to wrap this up, but what should we be saying to people that would be helping them? I can't think of anything now except try not to kill yourself because it'll be embarrassing in the next world.
Well, remember, we were talking about discernment largely, and I think the same theme as the last discussion, that is to think carefully about what it is that you're really certain about and why, and be open to the idea that you may not have the full understanding, whatever the field, whatever the subject, whether it's esoteric or whether it's hard science and reality or whether it's religion. Be open to the ideas of others.
You are much more charitable than I would be, because I would say, almost as a rule, we don't know the final thing about anything, and it's important to remember that we always have enough to get going to go by, but I am not under the illusion that I know anything, really. I have as close to certainties as I have are all based in my personal experience. Maybe that's true of everyone. I know you will not be able to persuade me that you can't talk to the guys upstairs. I mean, I know that can be done.
Yeah.
But beyond anything that I've personally experienced, I'm not sure there's anything that I know for sure. There are things I take for granted or I've been told and accept, but I don't suppose there's anything wrong with that. But the point is, it's better to remember that you don't know than to pretend that you do know. There we go.
Thank you. That's exactly right.
Well, this was an interesting discussion. It proves
Discussion,
that everything else, you and I are getting old.
Well, getting old is one of those interesting things, and for some folks listening, the point for them may well be how different times are for them than it was for us.
Well, I don't think.
And to recognize the same thing's going to hold true for them as they grow older, because things are going to continue to change,
and probably even
they
faster.
too will reach this place.
I don't.
All right.
I can't imagine how people today, young people especially, could even imagine the world that I grew up in, starting from 1946. No. It's changed 2 or 3 times over, and they could read about it, but they'll never really have a sense of it, I don't think. Anyway.
Well, some of the videos I've been watching just along that line have allowed me to have a very small taste of my grandfather's life. He was farming 5 sections of land and raising 10,000 head of draft horses and another 10 or 15,000 head of sheep. I can't even imagine that life.
I read historical novels because they're an excellent way of getting a view of past realities. Maurice Walsh, especially, about Ireland and Scotland and all. But even there, it's just a glimpse. It's just a keyhole. All right, brother. Next time.
All right. Take care.
All right.
Next time. Thank you.
If you enjoyed this episode, please press like. Please press subscribe to stay informed of new episodes as they appear. We would love to hear from you in the comments section below, and we wish you the very best in connecting with your own guidance.